Sometimes the quietest moment in a crowded place is the one that changes a life forever. The red seatbelt sign glowed softly above row 14 as the overnight flight from New York to Los Angeles hummed through the dark sky at 35,000 feet. Most of the cabin had settled into the slow rhythm of travel. Screens dimmed, blankets pulled close, the steady whisper of engines filling the air like distant wind. Daniel Hayes sat in seat 2A, his suit jacket folded neatly beside him, a tablet glowing faintly on the tray table. At 38, Daniel was the founder and CEO of Hayes Dynamics, a technology company whose software quietly powered everything from city infrastructure to global finance. His name appeared in business magazines, his calendar was booked months ahead, and his life ran on precision. Flights were usually quiet moments where he could think. But tonight, that quiet broke. A sharp cry pierced the calm from somewhere behind him. Not the brief fuss of a tired child, but a deep, exhausted wail that filled the cabin with raw frustration. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. A woman across the aisle sighed and adjusted her headphones. The flight attendant glanced back with a practiced smile that carried the silent promise she would handle it soon. But the crying didn't stop. It rose and fell again, small lungs fighting through tears that had clearly been building for a while. Daniel tried to return to the financial report on his screen, but the sound tugged at something he couldn't quite ignore. He closed the tablet slowly and turned in his seat. 3 rows behind him, a young toddler twisted restlessly in his seatbelt, tiny fists rubbing his eyes as tears rolled down round cheeks. His curls were slightly messy from sleep, and a small toy airplane dangled uselessly from one hand as he cried. Beside him sat a woman who looked exhausted but composed, gently rocking her arm and whispering soft reassurances that barely cut through the boy's frustration. Daniel hesitated for a moment, the way people do when they're unsure if stepping in is welcome. Then he stood and walked down the aisle. "Hey there, little man," he said quietly, crouching beside the seat. His voice was calm, warm, the kind of tone that carried patience without forcing it. The toddler paused mid-cry, blinking through watery eyes as if surprised someone new had entered. His small world of distress. Daniel gave a small smile and reached into his pocket, pulling out the silver pen he carried everywhere. "See this?" he said gently, clicking it once so the tiny light at the tip glowed. The child's crying slowed, curiosity replacing frustration in small cautious breaths. For a moment the cabin seemed to lean into the scene. The toddler sniffled, studying the light like it was something fascinating. Then Daniel finally looked at the child's face clearly, and something inside him stopped. The boy's eyes were a pale gray blue, the exact shade Daniel had seen in the mirror his entire life. The shape of the child's nose, the small crease between the eyebrows, even the curve of the chin. Familiar, uncomfortably familiar. Daniel felt a strange stillness settle over him, like the hum of the engines had suddenly dropped away. The toddler stared back at him now, tears drying on his cheeks, studying Daniel with the same quiet intensity children sometimes use when they're deciding if someone is safe. Then the boy reached forward and wrapped tiny fingers around Daniel's hand. The crying stopped completely, and for reasons Daniel couldn't explain yet, the moment felt less like coincidence and more like recognition. Daniel Hayes did not pull his hand away. The small fingers wrapped around his felt warm and steady, and for a moment he simply stayed there, crouched beside the seat, while the soft glow of the cabin lights reflected in the toddler's wide gray-blue eyes. The crying had completely stopped now. Around them the plane continued its quiet journey through the night sky, engines humming in a calm mechanical rhythm, while passengers slowly returned to their own thoughts. Daniel noticed that the boy was still studying him carefully, almost as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. The child tilted his head slightly, curls falling across his forehead, then gave a small, curious breath that sounded halfway between a laugh and a sigh. Daniel felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. It was not fear, and it was not confusion. It was something deeper, something he could not name yet. He gently released the pen light so the boy could hold it. The toddler gripped it with both hands, fascinated by the tiny glow at the tip, turning it slowly like it was the most interesting object in the world. Daniel finally looked up at the woman seated beside the child. She had been watching the entire moment quietly. Her posture was straight, composed, but her eyes carried the tired calm of someone who had spent many nights caring for a restless toddler alone. For a second Daniel only saw a stranger. Then recognition moved through him like a sudden current. Her face had changed slightly with time, softer around the edges, stronger somehow, but he knew those eyes. Aisha Carter. The name appeared in his mind before he even realized it. For years had passed since he had last seen her, yet the memory returned instantly. Aisha's expression did not show surprise. She looked at Daniel the way someone looks at a chapter of life that had already been closed long ago. Daniel slowly stood upright, still facing her across the narrow airplane aisle. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The only sound between them was the quiet rustle of blankets and the low murmur of passengers somewhere farther back in the cabin. Daniel finally cleared his throat softly. He stopped crying. He said, almost awkwardly, gesturing toward the child who was now happily turning the small pen light in his hands. Aisha gave a short nod. He likes lights, she replied calmly. Her voice was steady, measured, the same voice Daniel remembered from years earlier. The toddler leaned slightly against her arm now, still watching Daniel with bright curiosity. Daniel felt that strange stillness return again. The resemblance was impossible to ignore now that he was standing so close. The shape of the child's eyebrows, the line of his jaw, even the quiet way the boy observed everything before reacting. Daniel heard himself ask the question before he had fully decided to say it. Is he your son? Aisha looked down at the toddler for a brief second, then back at Daniel. Yes, she answered. Daniel nodded slowly, processing the obvious. Then the thought he had been trying to ignore finally reached the surface. His voice lowered slightly. What is his name? The toddler answered before she could. In a soft, cheerful voice, the boy pointed the glowing pen toward himself and said proudly, Liam. Daniel felt the name settle in the air between them. Liam Carter. The boy continued examining the light, completely unaware that the quiet moment in seat 14 had just begun to change 3 lives. At 35,000 feet above the country, Daniel Hayes remained standing beside the seat a moment longer than necessary, his eyes still resting on the small boy who now sat quietly, turning the silver pen light in his hands. The toddler seemed completely absorbed in the gentle glow, his earlier tears forgotten as the cabin returned to its calm midnight rhythm. Daniel felt the strange pull again, that quiet sense that something about this moment was not random at all. He looked from the child to Aisha Carter, and the years between the last time he saw her and now seemed to fold into a single uneasy breath. Aisha met his gaze without flinching. Her expression was calm but distant, like someone who had already lived through the questions Daniel was only beginning to ask. Daniel glanced down again at Liam. The boy's gray-blue eyes were unmistakable. Daniel had seen those same eyes staring back at him in mirrors, in childhood photographs, even in the framed portrait hanging in the lobby of his company headquarters. It was not just resemblance. It was something closer to reflection. Daniel spoke quietly, careful not to disturb the other passengers around them. How old is he? Aisha answered without hesitation. 3. The number settled heavily in Daniel's mind. 3 years. Daniel leaned one hand lightly against the back of the seat as he processed the timeline. His thoughts began moving quickly now, piecing together memories he had not revisited in a long time. 3 years ago, he had been consumed by the most chaotic period of his career. Investors, legal meetings, international travel, endless headlines about the sudden expansion of Hayes Dynamics. But before that storm began, there had been a brief moment of calm in his life. A quiet chapter he had never expected to close so abruptly. That chapter had a name. Aisha Carter. Daniel exhaled slowly. You live in Los Angeles now? He asked. Yes, she replied simply. The toddler suddenly lifted the pen light toward Daniel again, smiling as if proud of the object he had been given. Daniel could not help returning the smile. The child's warmth was natural and effortless, unaware of the complicated silence forming between the 2 adults beside him. Daniel looked at Aisha again, his voice lowering slightly. Aisha, I did not know. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. Did not know? What? Daniel hesitated for the first time in a long while. In boardrooms and investor meetings his words were always precise, immediate, confident. But here, standing in a dim airplane cabin with a small child watching him curiously, the sentence felt heavier than expected. I did not know you had a child. Aisha held his gaze for a few seconds before answering. You disappeared, Daniel. Her voice was not angry. It was calm, factual, like someone explaining a simple piece of history. You left New York. No call. No message. Nothing. Daniel felt the quiet truth of that statement settle between them. The toddler leaned against Aisha's arm now, blinking slowly as sleepiness returned to his small body. Aisha gently brushed Liam's curls away from his forehead. Daniel watched the gesture carefully. Then he spoke the question that had been building inside him since the moment he first saw the child's face. His voice was steady but quieter than before. Aisha, who is Liam's father? The cabin felt suddenly still. Aisha did not answer immediately. She simply looked at Daniel, then down at the boy who had already begun drifting back toward sleep while holding the glowing pin light in both hands. When she finally spoke, her words were soft but perfectly clear. You are. For a moment Daniel Hayes forgot the hum of the engines, the altitude of the plane, and the entire world waiting for him on the ground. All he could see was the small child sitting in seat 14, holding his hand just minutes earlier, with the same gray-blue eyes staring back at him. Daniel Hayes did not move. For a moment, he simply stood there in the narrow airplane aisle while Aisha's words settled into the quiet space around them. You are. The sentence was calm, almost gentle, yet it carried more weight than any boardroom decision he had ever faced. Daniel looked down at Liam again. The boy's head had begun to tilt slowly against his mother's arm, his eyelids growing heavy as sleep returned after the earlier burst of tears. The tiny pin light still glowed faintly between his fingers. Daniel's mind moved rapidly through the past, searching for certainty, for memory, for something that could explain how an entire life had unfolded without him even knowing. For years earlier, New York had been colder than usual that winter. Daniel remembered the long nights in the small restaurant near the Hudson where he and Aisha used to meet after work. She had been working as a design consultant for a marketing firm then, confident and thoughtful, always speaking with a quiet clarity that Daniel respected. Their relationship had not begun dramatically. It had grown slowly through conversations, late dinners, and walks along quiet streets where Daniel could forget that the company he was building was starting to attract national attention. For a few months his life had felt almost normal, but everything had changed quickly. Hayes Dynamics had entered a massive expansion phase that spring. Investors demanded complete focus. Legal teams, media interviews, international negotiations, endless travel between New York, San Francisco, and Seattle. Daniel had convinced himself that stepping away from everything personal would protect both his career and the people close to him. One rushed departure from New York had turned into weeks of silence. Weeks became months, and eventually the distance became permanent. Daniel had believed Aisha had simply moved on with her life. Now he stood here realizing that while he had been building a billion-dollar company, another life had quietly begun without him. He lowered his voice carefully. Aisha, if that is true, why did you never tell me? Aisha looked down at Liam before answering. She gently adjusted the blanket over his small shoulders so he could sleep more comfortably. Her movements were calm and practiced, the kind that came from years of caring for a child alone. When she finally spoke, her tone remained steady. Because you were gone, Daniel. Daniel frowned slightly. Gone where? Aisha met his eyes again. Everywhere. She gestured lightly toward the front of the plane where the quiet business class cabin began. Your company was suddenly on every business channel. Interviews, conferences, magazine covers. You were in San Francisco 1 week, London the next. I tried calling once. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Once. Aisha nodded. Your assistant answered. She said you were traveling and could not be reached. Daniel slowly looked away toward the dark airplane window where the faint outline of clouds drifted beneath the wing. He knew exactly which assistant she meant. That year his schedule had been guarded like a military operation. Calls filtered, meetings controlled, personal distractions eliminated. At the time he had believed that kind of discipline was necessary. Now the cost of that decision sat sleeping 3 rows behind seat 2A. Daniel turned back toward Liam. The boy shifted slightly in his sleep, tightening his small grip around the glowing pin light Daniel had given him. The resemblance felt even stronger now that Daniel knew the truth. Aisha watched Daniel carefully before speaking again, her voice quieter now. I found out about the pregnancy 2 weeks after you left New York. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the timeline. 2 weeks. Aisha continued softly. At that point you were already gone. Daniel opened his eyes again and looked at the sleeping child. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them as the plane continued across the dark sky. For the first time in years, Daniel Hayes felt completely unprepared for what came next. Daniel Hayes remained standing beside the seat long after Aisha finished speaking. The soft glow of the overhead cabin lights reflected faintly across Liam's sleeping face, and Daniel could not stop noticing the small details that now felt impossible to ignore. The curve of the boy's cheek, the quiet way his eyebrows gathered when he shifted in his sleep. Even the steady rhythm of his breathing felt strangely familiar. Daniel slowly lowered himself into the empty aisle seat across from them. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of time, not as numbers on a business chart, but as 3 silent years that had unfolded without him. The plane continued its smooth path through the dark sky, the engines humming gently, while most of the passengers had already fallen asleep. The quiet made every thought inside Daniel's mind louder. 3 years, he said softly, almost to himself. Aisha did not respond immediately. She kept one hand resting lightly on Liam's shoulder, the protective gesture of a mother who had learned to remain alert even when her child slept. After a moment, Daniel looked up again. "Did you ever think about telling me later?" he asked. His voice carried no anger, only the careful tone of someone trying to understand a story he had missed. Aisha watched him for a few seconds before answering. "Many times." Daniel waited. "But every time I considered it," she continued, "I asked myself what it would actually change." Daniel frowned slightly. "It would have changed everything." Aisha shook her head slowly. "Not at the beginning." Her voice remained calm, but there was quiet strength in the way she spoke. "You were building something enormous, Daniel. Your company was growing faster than anyone expected. Every interview you gave talked about expansion, global markets, innovation. Your life was moving in a direction that did not have space for surprises." Daniel leaned back slightly in the narrow airplane seat, absorbing her words. He remembered that year clearly now. Every day had been consumed by contracts, investors, and the pressure of turning a promising technology company into a global powerhouse. Personal life had become a luxury he convinced himself he could delay. Aisha continued, speaking quietly. "When I learned I was pregnant, I had 2 choices. I could chase someone who had already left, or I could focus on the life that was about to begin." Daniel's eyes returned to Liam. The toddler shifted slightly, the pen light slipping gently from his fingers before Aisha caught it and set it on the tray table. Daniel noticed how naturally she moved, every action practiced from years of caring for the child alone. "Was it difficult?" Daniel asked after a moment. Aisha smiled faintly, though the expression carried exhaustion more than humor. "Raising a child alone is always difficult." She paused, then added quietly, "But Liam made it worth every challenge." Daniel nodded slowly. He could see that clearly now. Even in sleep, the boy's presence seemed to fill the small airplane row with quiet warmth. Daniel leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice even more. "Aisha, I need to know something." She looked at him calmly. Daniel hesitated only a second before asking, "Are you certain?" Aisha understood the question immediately. She did not appear offended. Instead, she gave a small, understanding nod. "You mean, are you certain that Liam is your son?" Daniel held her gaze. "Yes." Aisha reached into her bag beside the seat and pulled out a small, folded photograph. She handed it to him. Daniel unfolded it carefully. It was a picture of Liam taken sometime during the past year. The boy was standing outside a park playground, smiling brightly at the camera. But what made Daniel's breath pause was not the smile. It was the unmistakable reflection staring back at him. The same eyes, the same expression he had seen in childhood photos of himself. Daniel slowly looked back up at Aisha. She spoke quietly, her voice steady as the plane carried them across the sleeping country below. "I never needed a test to know the truth, Daniel. Liam is your son." Daniel Hayes held the photograph a few seconds longer before carefully folding it and handing it back to Aisha. The small image had settled something inside him that logic alone could not ignore. The resemblance was no longer a possibility or a coincidence. It was a quiet truth sitting only 3 feet away, breathing softly beneath a thin airplane blanket. Daniel leaned forward slightly and rested his elbows on his knees, his eyes drifting again to Liam's sleeping face. The boy had shifted deeper into sleep now, his head gently tilted toward the window, curls pressed against the soft fabric of the seat. The faint glow of the cabin lights traced the same familiar lines Daniel had seen in childhood photographs of himself. For a man who had spent most of his life making fast decisions under pressure, Daniel suddenly felt an unusual hesitation. This was not a negotiation, not a contract, not a problem that could be solved with strategy. This was a life that had already been growing for 3 years without him. Daniel finally spoke quietly. "Aisha, if Liam is my son, I should have been there." His voice carried a weight that surprised even him. Aisha did not answer immediately. She adjusted Liam's blanket again, making sure it covered his shoulders before resting her hand gently along his back. Her calm movements seemed almost instinctive after years of practice. "You cannot change the past, Daniel," she said softly. "I know," he replied, "but I can change what happens next." Aisha looked at him carefully, studying the sincerity behind his words. Daniel could see the hesitation in her expression, the cautious distance of someone who had learned not to depend on promises. The plane shifted slightly as it passed through a mild pocket of air, the gentle motion barely noticeable to the sleeping passengers. Daniel glanced briefly toward the aisle before lowering his voice even further. "I want to be part of his life." Aisha's eyes moved back to Liam, then returned to Daniel. "It is not that simple." Daniel nodded. "I understand that it will take time." Aisha gave a small thoughtful breath. "It is not only about time." Daniel waited. "Liam has a routine," she continued calmly. "A preschool he enjoys. A small apartment where he knows every corner. Friends at the park near our building. His world is stable." Daniel absorbed her words carefully. "And I would never want to disrupt that," he said. "I only want the chance to know him." The quiet sincerity in his voice seemed to soften something in the space between them. Aisha leaned back slightly in her seat, crossing her arms loosely as she considered the situation. The engines continued their steady hum while the plane crossed above the sleeping Midwest below. Daniel glanced again at Liam. The boy suddenly shifted and murmured softly in his sleep, his small hand moving across the tray table until it brushed Daniel's sleeve. Daniel instinctively reached out and gently steadied the child's hand so he would not slide forward. Liam's fingers wrapped loosely around Daniel's thumb for a moment before relaxing again. Daniel froze, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. Aisha watched the moment silently. When Liam settled again, Daniel carefully withdrew his hand. The quiet connection left an unexpected warmth in his chest. Aisha finally spoke again. "You should understand something before you make promises tonight." Daniel looked up. Her voice remained calm but firm. "Liam does not know anything about you." Daniel nodded slowly. "That makes sense." "To him," she continued. "You are simply the kind man who helped him stop crying on an airplane." Daniel looked at the sleeping child again. The simplicity of that description struck him deeply. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, Daniel Hayes realized that the most important introduction he would ever make had not happened in a boardroom or a press conference. It had happened quietly in seat 14 at 35,000 feet. Liam stirred again as the plane continued gliding through the quiet darkness above the country, the engines producing a steady hum that had become almost comforting in the still cabin. Daniel Hayes remained seated across from Aisha, his attention returning again and again to the small boy sleeping beside the window. Every few minutes Liam shifted slightly, pressing closer to the armrest as if instinctively searching for a familiar presence even while asleep. Daniel noticed how Aisha never fully relaxed. Even when she leaned back, one hand always remained lightly against Liam's shoulder, ready to steady him if he moved too much. It was the quiet vigilance of a parent who had learned to protect a child through long nights and crowded places alone. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice low enough not to disturb the other passengers. "How long have you been in Los Angeles?" Aisha answered calmly. "Almost 2 years." Daniel nodded slowly. "Before that you were still in New York?" "For Liam's first year, yes," she replied. Daniel considered that timeline carefully. That meant his son had taken his first steps only a few miles away from Daniel's own apartment in Manhattan, yet their lives had never crossed paths. The realization left a quiet heaviness in his chest. Liam shifted again and made a small sleepy sound, his fingers moving slowly across the tray table until they brushed the pen light once more. Daniel gently slid it closer so the child could keep holding it without waking fully. Liam's small hand closed around it again instinctively, and his breathing returned to a calm rhythm. Aisha watched Daniel's careful movement. "You seem comfortable with him," she said softly. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful breath. "I am surprised by that myself." Aisha studied him a moment longer before asking quietly, "Do you have any children?" Daniel shook his head. "No." The answer felt different now than it had during every previous conversation in his life. Until tonight, the statement had always been simple, factual. Now it carried the quiet knowledge that the truth had been waiting in seat 14 all along. Daniel leaned slightly forward again. "What is Liam like?" Aisha smiled faintly at the question, the first real smile since their conversation began. "Airplanes, apparently," she said. Daniel glanced at the toy aircraft still resting near Liam's seatbelt. "That explains the enthusiasm earlier." Aisha nodded. "He likes watching planes take off. Sometimes we go to the observation deck near the airport just so he can see them." Daniel imagined the scene for a moment. A small boy standing behind a railing, pointing excitedly at airplanes lifting into the sky while his mother watched beside him. The picture felt strangely vivid. "What else?" Daniel asked. Aisha looked down at Liam affectionately. "Dinosaurs. Orange juice. Storybooks with animals." Daniel listened carefully, committing each small detail to memory the way he would remember the specifications of an important project. Except this felt far more personal. The plane cabin dimmed slightly as the flight crew lowered the lighting for the remaining overnight hours. Outside the window, the sky stretched endlessly dark, scattered with faint stars above the wing. Daniel rested his hands together, considering his next words carefully. "Aisha, when we land tomorrow, I would like the chance to see him again." Aisha did not answer immediately. She watched Liam sleep peacefully, then slowly turned her gaze back toward Daniel. "That depends," she said quietly. Daniel waited. "On whether you are asking out of curiosity," she continued, "or responsibility." Daniel met her eyes without hesitation. Responsibility. The word lingered between them while the plane continued its silent path toward Los Angeles. Aisha looked at him for several seconds, measuring the sincerity behind that answer. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Then we will talk again after we land." Daniel glanced once more at Liam, the soft rise and fall of the boy's breathing steady beneath the blanket. For the first time since hearing the truth, Daniel felt something shift quietly inside him. Not panic, not uncertainty, something closer to purpose. Liam woke slowly sometime later as the cabin lights brightened slightly to signal that the flight was beginning its gradual descent toward Los Angeles. The gentle change in lighting stirred several passengers from sleep, and the quiet murmur of movement returned to the aisle as people adjusted their seats and stretched after the long overnight journey. Liam blinked a few times, clearly confused for a moment about where he was, his small hand still holding the silver pen light Daniel had given him earlier. He looked down at it, then up again, and his eyes immediately found Daniel sitting across from him. For a brief second, the toddler simply stared, his sleepy mind recognizing the familiar face that had helped him stop crying hours earlier. Then a small smile appeared. Daniel felt the simple expression land somewhere deeper than expected. "Good morning, Liam," he said softly. The boy did not answer with words at first. Instead, he lifted the glowing pen light slightly, as if proudly showing that he had kept it safe the entire time. Daniel smiled gently. "You held on to it all night." Aisha watched the exchange quietly, noticing how natural the moment looked despite everything that had been revealed during the flight. Liam turned slightly toward his mother. "Are we there?" he asked with the slow voice of a child still waking up. Aisha brushed his curls gently away from his forehead. "Almost," she said calmly. Outside the airplane window, the dark sky had begun to soften with the faintest hint of morning light far along the horizon. The wing lights blinked steadily as the aircraft began its slow descent through the clouds toward California. Liam suddenly looked back at Daniel again, studying him with curious interest the way young children often do when deciding if someone belongs in their world. "You help me," Liam said in a quiet voice, remembering the earlier moment when Daniel had knelt beside his seat. Daniel nodded. "I tried." Liam considered that answer seriously for a moment before speaking again. "You nice." The simplicity of the statement caused Aisha to glance briefly at Daniel. For someone who had spent his career surrounded by carefully chosen words and formal introductions, the toddler's honest conclusion felt unexpectedly meaningful. Liam then slid the pen light across the tray table toward Daniel, as if returning something valuable. Daniel shook his head gently. You can keep it. Liam's face brightened instantly. He clutched the pen light again, clearly pleased with the decision. A flight attendant's voice came over the cabin speaker reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts as the plane prepared for landing. Aisha secured Liam's belt carefully and adjusted the blanket around him. Daniel returned to his original seat in the row ahead, but turned slightly so he could still see them. As the aircraft descended through the morning clouds, the first golden light of sunrise spread across the wing outside the window. Liam pressed his small face closer to the glass, fascinated by the view. Airplanes go up there, he said proudly, pointing toward the distant sky where another aircraft passed far away. Daniel watched him with quiet attention. Aisha noticed the expression and spoke softly from behind him. He talks about airplanes every day. Daniel nodded slowly. Maybe one day I will take him to see them up close. Aisha did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at Liam, who was now completely awake and whispering excitedly about the clouds below them. The plane touched down gently on the runway a few minutes later, tires meeting the pavement with a soft rolling sound as the cabin filled with the familiar rush of reverse engines. Passengers began gathering their belongings while the aircraft taxied toward the terminal. Liam looked back at Daniel once more and waved the small pen light in the air like a tiny signal. Daniel raised his hand in return. For the toddler, it was a simple goodbye to a friendly stranger from the flight. But for Daniel Hayes, stepping off that airplane in Los Angeles meant walking into a life he had only discovered a few hours earlier, one that had been waiting quietly at 35,000 feet. The cabin doors finally opened as the aircraft reached the gate, and the quiet line of passengers slowly began moving toward the exit. The early morning light of Los Angeles Airport spilled softly through the windows, reflecting across polished floors and the metallic surface of the airplane wing outside. Daniel Hayes stepped into the aisle and reached for his jacket, but his attention remained fixed on the row behind him where Aisha was helping Liam out of his seat. The toddler had woken fully now, energized by the excitement of landing. He stood carefully on the seat while Aisha unfastened the belt, clutching the small silver pen light like it was a treasured discovery from the flight. We landed, Liam announced proudly, as if he had personally helped guide the airplane down. Aisha smiled softly and lifted him into the aisle. Daniel stepped aside to give them space, watching quietly as Liam looked around the cabin with wide curiosity. The boy spotted Daniel almost immediately and waved the glowing pen light again. Look, Liam said happily, I still have it. Daniel smiled. I can see that. Passengers continued moving slowly toward the front exit, their quiet footsteps echoing along the narrow aisle. When it was their turn, Aisha lifted Liam onto her hip and stepped forward. Daniel followed only a few steps behind them. The moment they stepped out of the aircraft door, the cool morning air of the terminal brushed across their faces. Airport announcements echoed faintly through the high ceiling as travelers moved in every direction with suitcases and backpacks. Liam looked around with bright excitement, fascinated by the wide, open terminal compared to the small airplane cabin. Daniel paused beside Aisha near the gate entrance while the crowd slowly passed around them. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The reality of the situation had followed them off the plane and into the morning light. Finally, Aisha shifted Liam slightly on her hip and looked at Daniel calmly. We should go, she said gently. Daniel nodded. Of course. He hesitated only a second before adding. But I meant what I said earlier. Aisha studied his face carefully. Daniel continued in a steady voice. I want to know him. Not just today, not just because of this flight. I want to be present. Liam tugged lightly on Aisha's sleeve at that moment. Mama, he whispered, pointing excitedly toward a large window where another airplane was taxiing across the runway outside. Aisha smiled at his excitement, but her attention returned to Daniel after a moment. This will not be simple, she said honestly. I know, Daniel replied. But some things are worth learning slowly. Aisha considered his words while Liam continued watching the airplanes outside the glass wall. Finally, she reached into her bag and removed a small piece of paper. She wrote something quickly before handing it to Daniel. This is my number, she said. If you truly want to be part of Liam's life, we will talk about how that happens. Daniel accepted the paper carefully. For a moment, he simply looked down at the phone number written there. A small but important beginning. Liam suddenly turned back toward him again. By airplane man. the toddler said cheerfully, still holding the pen light. Daniel laughed softly. Goodbye, Liam. Aisha gave Daniel one last measured look before turning toward the exit corridor leading deeper into the terminal. Liam waved once more as they walked away, the tiny light in his hand blinking gently with each step. Daniel remained standing near the gate for a moment longer, watching them disappear into the morning crowd. Around him the airport buzzed with the routine rhythm of travel, but for Daniel Hayes the world had quietly shifted during one overnight flight. Somewhere in the terminal ahead was a small boy with his eyes, his curiosity, and a future that Daniel now intended to be part of, one step at a time.